this afternoon, which is on how to adopt practices to address the racial aspect of suffering. Moderating this panel will be Professor Charles Hallisey, and I have had the honor and the challenge of being one of his students for the past couple of years. Professor Hallisey joined the faculty of the Divinity School in 2007 and 2008, but he has a career that extends beyond that, beginning, I won't do this, but at any rate, he works primarily in South Asian Buddhism. He's been a wonderful member of the faculty here, teaching a number of courses, including those on Buddhist ethics, practices of scriptural reading and interpretation, and serving as a mentor to many of the HDS students present and past currently in the room. He's currently the Yehan Numata Senior Lecturer in Buddhist Studies. I think I got that title correct. But we're really excited to have him moderating this panel, and I believe we know all the panelists, and you're going to introduce the panelists. I don't usually do this, so I'm going to hand this over to Professor Hallisey now, and thank you all for being here again. Great job.
I want to just begin by thanking Sunjin for the introduction, and in particular for not reminding me of just how deeply back what's on my police blotter of my professional life is, so that not reminding me just how old I've become without noticing it. Equally fair as an introduction for me, in addition to the things you can say, Professor or Yehan Numata, Senior Lecturer, I think it would be equally accurate to say about myself, and just quote the words of the Jodo Shinshu teacher Shinran, I'm a foolish being mired in karmic evil. The karmic evil that all of us are aware of today at this conference is just the institutional, the social, the historical racism that exists, that just shapes American life day by day. I also think that today we shouldn't forget that other kinds of karmic evil that are shaping the things that are happening to us is that I am a citizen of a nation that dropped 23,000 bombs in 2015. I am a resident of a country that has put more than 5 billion tons of carbon into the air. And I am also a member of humanity that is putting 29 million tons of carbon into the air per second. So all of these things are part of the karmic evil that we find ourselves in. Not to be too serious about things. Serious. Now, like this morning, the presenters on this panel, which is about how to adopt practices to address the racial aspect of suffering. The panelists were provided with some questions in advance to reflect on, and that's perhaps where they'll begin their own comments. I've shared these questions with you so you could see some of the things that they have been reflecting on. What I'm going to do is to introduce all of them together, not one by one, and to allow them to kind of move through. And perhaps what we'll do is to take up each question in turn in something of an order. And then after a dialogue between the members of the panel, we can turn it to a dialogue of everyone who's here this afternoon. So first, I'm very happy to introduce Eleanor Hancock. Eleanor Hancock holds a Master of Fine Arts from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she began a study of whiteness in the context of performance art, identity politics, and critical postmodern theory. She has foundational experience in group facilitation, curriculum and website development, community organizing, and activism. She has trained with Joanna Macy in facilitation of the work that reconnects, and currently serves on the faith leaders team with Showing Up for Racial Justice, as well as the local steering committee of the District of Columbia chapter. Rebecca Lee was introduced this morning, but let me just remind all of us of both her background, what she brings to this conference, and in part, to remind her of who she is. I know that she was distracted for a second about no self and emptiness, and so I just want to remind her who she is. Rebecca Lee began practicing in 1995 when she was in graduate school in California. and attended her first 7-day intensive retreat in New York with Chan Master Shen Yan, founder of the Dharma Drum Retreat Center, in the following year. Since then, she has attended numerous intensive Chan retreats. In 1999, after moving to New Jersey, she began serving as Master Shen Yan's translator. In the same year, she began her training with the master to become a Dharma and meditation instructor. Currently, she teaches meditation and Dharma classes and gives public lectures, leads Chan practice, and conducts 1 to 5 day retreats at Dharma Drum centers across North America. She served on the organizing committee of the 2015 Generation X Dharma Teachers Conference hosted by the Dharma Drum Retreat Center. And recently, she taught a month-long online retreat for Tricycle and contributed a piece to the premier issue of the Lion's Roar magazine. Rebecca is also a board member of the Dharma Drum Retreat Center and associate professor of sociology at the College of New Jersey. And in her spare time, what little there seems to be, she likes to read, hike, play tennis, go to the ballet, orchestra, and opera, and is learning to play the piano. Lama Rod Owens is known to all of us. He has been essentially visible in this conference, and we have a great debt of gratitude to him. Let me remind him of who he is. Lama Rod Owens is an activist, organizer, essayist, poet, and authorized Dharma teacher in the Tibetan Tantric tradition of Buddhism. He also owes me a paper. Don't let that bother you. He is a core teacher with Natural Dharma Fellowship in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a second-year Master of Divinity student at Harvard Divinity School, where he studies the intersection of Buddhism and social change. He has appeared in the Buddhist publications Lion's Roar and Buddha Dharma, and has been recognized as an emerging leader of the next generation of Dharma teachers. And he has a book coming out this year, Radical Dharma, which explores race and oppression within the American Buddhist communities. And you can read one of Rod's most recent writings in the Harvard Divinity School Bulletin, which there's copies that are circulating around here today. And what you're looking for is the featured essay entitled Woman, Hold My Hand, Visualizing Tara. Finally, Greg Snyder. Reverend Greg Snyder is a Dharma teacher at Brooklyn Zen Center, as well as its co-founder and current president. He's also the senior director of Buddhist studies at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Greg Snyder was ordained as a Zen Buddhist priest by Soshin Taeya-Strozer in the lineage of Shunryu Suzuki. And he asked me not to read anything more, so I'm not going to. And with that, I'll be pleased ask you to join me in welcoming all of our panelists, but first of all, Eleanor Hancock.
All right, so let me acclimate myself to the microphone. Can I just hold this thing, or is it better? That will be better, right? Then I can have a natural seating in my chair. Yeah, so the first question that it looks like we will all be addressing is, what practices have you found in your tradition to work with racial forms of oppression? What I'd like to do to start off what I have to say is actually share a practice that doesn't come from Buddhism. It's a practice that I'm learning from the other activists that I'm in community with, and that is to acknowledge the First Nations and the people whose land we're on. So the people whose land we're on are the Wampanoag, and their name means people of the first light. Around the time of the beginning of the European occupation of these lands, there were about 40,000 people in the 67 villages that made up the Wampanoag Nation. And today there's about 4,000 Wampanoag who live in New England. They've been living here for over 15,000 years. And with the current occupation continuing in the state that has occurred the way that it has, and the effects on the natural environment and the restrictions on people to practice their indigenous cultural practices, obviously they can't live the same way that their ancestors did, but they There's some good information online where the Wampanoag speak for themselves and talk about the ways that they adapt and continue their way of life and their language and their traditions and their culture in this area. So it's important to me to take a moment at the beginning of occasions like this when we're getting together to talk about racism and restorative justice, really, that needs to happen deeply in this country, and collective liberation, that we honor the first people, the places where we are. And as I think about this place and this land, there are the people who remain, and there are the ancestors that are here, and the energy of their life is in this place. And when we think about time and the depth of time of human people living here, we're a little bitty speck at the end of a long time. So there's really a resonance, I feel, of the first people. And that's true of any place on earth, and is part of the practice that I feel when we're bringing, in terms of Buddhist practice and inquiry, that's a question that I think all of us, wherever we live and whenever we move, is to understand the place where we're living and the people who are of that place. So in terms of my own practice, I am not focused in one particular tradition. I have a background in secular mindfulness training, and I have had the most experience in Dharma community and communities of practice within Insight Buddhism in Washington, D.C., and then I've been very influenced by reading and studying Thich Nhat Hanh. So I have a few different ideas about Buddhist practices that are helpful, and in directing the project White Awake, my focus is working with white people and how white people can engage around educating ourselves and doing the inner transformative work necessary to show up differently in the world and be part of collective liberation. So starting with the Four Noble Truths, we're told to notice suffering, which honestly for white people, I think that doesn't always happen, to notice that we are part of a racial system that totally sucks, and it sucks for us too. And we're kept comfortable and we're socialized in a way to not look at that. But there's, white supremacy lives in us and our bodies and our interactions with other people and keeps us from being truly human. So, you look at your suffering, you notice your suffering, and then you make an inquiry into the causes of that suffering. So, to make an inquiry into racism, it's going to require study. It's going to require reading, engaging in conversation, watching videos, going to workshops. I mean, it's not something that there's a lot of information we need that we don't already have, especially white people. So, in addition to, understanding the history of racism, how it's developed and things such as that, I think it's really important to find out your own story. And you might know it or you might not know it, but how did your people, especially for white people, how did your people become white? Like, what was that process? What did that look like? What is your coming to America story? And also study the history of the place where you live. And that includes, especially in urban areas, if there's a racially segregated ghetto where you live, how did that come about? How did that, it's not natural that there would be people living in conditions of poverty. So making an inquiry into that. And so anytime you gather information, then you can bring that into your practice space, which can be internal practice and it can be reflection with other people. And you sit with it, you sit with what you're learning, you share with others, and you listen to how you're called to respond. So, do I have time to say a couple other things? Is that all right? So, I think that a practice that's very helpful in terms of your individual practice is Tonglen. And Pema Chodron has some wonderful teachings on this. And what's really beautiful about it is the idea of when we come to our suffering, we're not trying to breathe ourselves out of it or go to some other beautiful place. We are deeply feeling and embracing what is there and the suffering that is there. And when white people go down this path, there's a process of ego disintegration that happens because we are not who we thought we were. Our country is not what we thought it was. That's a very uncomfortable process. So having a way to sit with that, having a practice to sit with all of that discomfort and realize that we have the capacity to understand the truth. We do not have to live in denial. And so the Tonglen practice is very good for that. And then coming from insight, Kalyana Metta is a fairly informal practice of people gathering together in small groups and sharing with one another, and you might have a reading that you focus on, but you sit together and then you speak in community, and it's you can bow in and bow out of what you have to say, but it's a way of speaking mindfully from personal experience. And so many practices in Buddhism are internally focused. It's good to have practices that we bring mindfulness to the way that we relate to other people, because this is a social issue and a social problem, so we're going to need to engage with one another. The very last thing that I'll say is that I think that it would be important to be creative in how we approach spiritual practice together and push the limits on what we can consider part of our Buddhist practice even. In the work that I've done with Joanna Macy and in the work that reconnects, there is a community ritual called the Truth Mandala. Has anyone here experienced that aside from me? Okay, yeah, quite a few people. So this is something that grew up actually in East Germany, and it was a group of activists who needed a cathartic community ritual to process grief and anger and other difficult emotions. But we cannot just sit quietly with all of these things. We really need community spaces to grieve. And I think that the blockage of grief is actually where a good deal of white defensiveness can sometimes come from, is there is so much, like, I do not believe it can possibly be that bad. And if you really believe it's that bad, then you have to have a space to truly grieve it. So, thank you.
Yeah, it's funny, I wrote these questions for the panel and I totally forgot what they were. I think many of you know this, especially if you said it in my last session, breakout group. I really recently have been working around issues of intersectionality in Dharma practice. And it's not that I've been specifically adopting tantric practices from a perspective of like racial justice and healing, but what I've been doing is approaching practices from my own intersectionality. And I recently, in my latest work with working with Tara, I've been asking myself, how do I relate to Tara as a person of color? How do I relate to this figure, this deity, Green Tara? Often she emanates as a woman of color, and what are some ways of thinking about her that have been liberating for me? And I've been working with womanism lately as this understanding, this idea and practice that though it wasn't created specifically for my body, for a male body, it was definitely created as a liberatory ideology and practice that offers tremendous insight into my experiences as a cisgendered queer male. But womanism emerged for the benefit of women of color. And how does Tara in my practice function as a woman of color? And so that was the central question around this work, and that led into understanding Tara as this a source of liberation for me, as an unconditional source of compassion and love, as a body, though iconographically is colored, but relatively transcends racialization. So this is a woman of color who transcends color. And how can I embody that kind of transcendence? How can I recognize what I am and then transcend through that to an ultimate way of being, which is fundamentally free? how can I bring, and I'm speaking specifically about Tantric or Tibetan Buddhism, but how do we bring the deity from the sky in front of us into the body right here that we're occupying? So how does Tara free me right now in this very moment? Considering all of my intersectionality, all of my different identity locations. Traditionally, in my training in Tibetan Buddhism, racism really isn't something that we talk about or think about. And so there aren't many different people of color coming through my tradition as teachers. And so I find what I'm doing to be very groundbreaking, by asking how does Tantra relate to my experience, particularly as a racialized Black man, has been deeply transformative for me. And so I continue to ask those questions. I continue to say, what does Tara or what does any deity have to do with me? Where's the deity at, and what is the role of the deity when perhaps I'm in a situation of being racially profiled? Where is the deity at when I'm at the protest or the march or the die-in? How does my devotion and belief and practice of the deity help me to make sense of the relative world right now? And I think that's something, that's the question that we have to ask ourselves. How does this practice help me to be free right here in this moment, in this body? Not in the next life, not anywhere else besides in this body I've been placed and located in this life. So intersectionality and making, again, the practices relevant to where we are. So I think we have a tendency, and I used to have this tendency as well, to separate everything out, to compartmentalize everything. So I go to the Dharma Center and do my practice, and that's very different than me going home. Or that's very different than me going to the club, or that's very different than me going out and hooking up one night, or that's very different than me going out and drinking. I think that's fundamentally very unhealthy. I think that's how we get, and this is part of the second question, so I'll limit this. But I think that's how we get into ways of kind of bypassing, some of the things that we really need to be working with, and bringing into focus. But how can we bring the practice and integrate it and thread it through our whole lives? How do we bring, again, the compassion and the love and the kindness of Tara, who is called the Mother Liberator, into every aspect of our lives? And asking ourselves, what does it mean to be liberated? From what I'm feeling in the sangha, what does it mean to be liberated from my experiences of being whatever identity location I occupy? So that's important. That's also very subversive within our sanghas. Part of the control part of the way power is expressed in sanghas is by dictating how practices are practiced and what is practiced and who has a right to practice certain things. I question that, and I wonder why in certain traditions in the root country, the mother countries of these practices, there were very different restrictions for these things, for these practices. But in America, we have all kinds of restrictions and people creating boundaries that actually, maybe don't have the right to make boundaries, create boundaries for us in our practice. So I think that's all I would say.
I got this question, and I've been thinking about it, and I've been trying to figure out another answer, but I could only think of this one, so I'm going to share the only one I could come up with. Because the question is about practices, but I'm going to share something that's not exactly a practice per se, but I practice with it. And I'm going to speak to not just about the racial aspect of it, but also the gender aspect of it. Because the way I read this question is, when I see the word racial aspect of suffering, I read it as how we get treated based on our appearance, our characteristic, whether it's my skin color or my form of being a woman or a man. And in addition to that, in my tradition, is whether you're a lay person or a monastic. Okay. I don't know what's going to happen now. I just said this, because that's being recorded. So they are all the same in my mind in the sense that they are about your characteristics. And connecting with what Rod just said, that there's a lot of baggage about depending on your characteristic. And actually, in traditional Chinese Buddhism, there's less dialogue about race, but I'm not saying there's dialogue, but there's idea about the role of women and men and monastic and lay people. And I have used that to apply to the as a racial aspect. I want you to remember who I am, so okay. I apply it to that. And the way I have worked with these other characteristics of gender and lay and monastic, which I find applicable to the racial aspect, is this very important teaching from the Diamond Sutra. And I want to share the lines that been very useful since the very first time I read this sutra. These lines stuck to me very, very, very clearly. So it is in this chapter where the Tathagata said that the Tathagata cannot be recognized. Though it's actually Subhuti who said that. So but the Tathagata cannot be recognized by any material characteristic. And then the Buddha said, Subhuti, wheresoever material characteristic, there is delusion. And this doesn't convey the line that I read in Chinese in this original text, but what he's saying is that you cannot use someone's material characteristic, physical characteristic, to determine whether someone is a Buddha or not. Basically, it's saying that you cannot use that to determine whether someone has Buddha nature or not. And in fact, everybody has Buddha nature. That's in another chapter of this sutra. And this is an extremely important idea and teaching in Chan Buddhism. And the obstacle for most people is to believe in it, actually, literally. It's so easy for people to believe that, no, I have to wait until I get reborn and can become a monastic. Now and then I have Buddha nature. It's like, no. Right now you have Buddha nature. Right now, next moment, you have the potential, right now in this moment, to realize your Buddha nature. But you have to believe in it. And but the counterproductive belief of no, if you're a woman, then your role is not so much actually practicing Chan, but you're here to support, you help, cook for the retreat, or do paperwork or run the center. That's how you're a supporter, you're Dharma supporter, and you're supporting the Dhamma that way, or that kind of thing. And then you teach, you don't really teach the Chan thing, that you teach, you teach chanting. Now I'm not saying chanting is not a good practice. That's not what I mean. You teach something that's not looking directly into your mind. And so the idea that you dare to think that you're someone to do that, it's just something you have to really be willing to believe that, no, that's what the Buddha said. Like, it doesn't matter that you have a woman's body. You have Buddha nature. You have every right as everyone else to investigate your Buddha nature and realize it. But you have to believe in it. You have to see that. And it's so easy to fall into the belief that, no, I was taught that I can't. And the same dynamic happens with the lay and monastic division. And so it's very difficult. I have to convince a lot of lay practitioners, no, like, you don't have to wait until you can become a monastic to be really able to practice and well. You can practice well. And actually, in another sutra by Huinan in the same book, talk about that exactly in the 600s. He recognized this problem that people had who wouldn't believe that they truly have the Buddha nature. And they thought, oh no, it's the monastic. Like, I'm a lay person, I'm just this person whose role is to support the monastic, to give donation and cook and clean for the temples, and that's it. Like, their job is that they are the one who have the job of doing real practice. So then we convince ourselves, no, I'm not worthy enough to do the real practice. And we shy away from really doing the work of looking into our heart and into our mind. And dare to believe that we can do it. And that is our main obstacle, because this practice is pretty simple. Like, everyone talked about it. But like, to believe that you really can do it. And it's easy to give up, because after you see your mind is kind of all over the place, you go, oh, I guess I'm just kind of screwing up. That's like, yeah, it must be because I'm not monastic, I can't do this. Or because I'm a woman, I can't do this. Or I'm, not the right skin color, I can't do this. And it goes different way. Right here in America, we somehow develop the belief that, like, the white teacher is the better, like the closer to enlightened one. Like, I have a friend who just told me, I shared this over at lunch. Who she told me she's of South Asian descent, and she led this group retreat, like she was leading the retreat with several other teachers, and the retreatant get assigned a teacher through this long retreat, and share the retreatant who came to her expressing her disappointment that she got her instead of the white teacher. And so I was like, oh, interesting. So how did you respond to that? And she said, well, like, I explained to this retreatant that, like, well, my ancestry is much closer to where Buddha was from. And I'm going to plagiarize that one. But there is the opposite happening. I had one of my teachers who was a Englishman, very, very accomplished practitioner, and I had a friend who, when she went to, she's a Korean American, and she told me the first time she went to his retreat, she sat there, is like, who does he think he is, being white man, and he can teach Dharma, like, he needs to be at least Asian to know that kind of idea. So there are all these kind of ideas, assumptions going around, thinking that you have to look a certain way to be able to understand and practice the Dharma, when no, you can't tell by people's physical characteristic. And in this sutra, in the Dharma Sutra, go over and over and over and over and over again. And there's just that one line, that's what I use in my practice. Anytime this kind of funny idea comes into my mind, like, no, like, that's how this faith in my own Buddha nature is maintained. And that is what helped me with the practice through the years, and I want to share that.
So in terms of practices, the thought that came up when I read this, what practices, I thought, well, all of them, in terms of the practices. I mean, there are there are different ways to bring each of the practices to bear on this, whether it be meditation or whether it be mindfulness practice or whatever it is. So I thought I would just talk about a few things that that we use. I mean, I think that one thing that's been very important for me, because this process can be so dislodging in a way, is to treat our basic. For years, every time I sat down on a meditation seat, I rooted into the earth in a very, very clear way. You know, that I let myself, and I think this is what the Buddha taught us when he called, you know, when corrosive doubt or self-doubt was the final attempt of Mara. The witness was the earth. You know, the witness was the birthright of the earth itself. So to really let ourselves be held as actually all of us at one time indigenous people, that we've lost our connection to that, and to let ourselves be held in that way. But then there are processes like, for example, we have something in Zen called koan practice. So this practice, really, to simplify it, really it's taking something and it's dropping it into the body deeply. So in this case, one of the ways that we work with it, and there are all kinds of ways of doing this. I mean, emptiness is dropped in the body, no self is dropped in the body, lots of these things, and you the point of it is when you drop it in, all the resistances and all the ways we don't want to accept this, it all percolates. It kind of brings up, in the way loving kindness brings up everything unlike itself. We start seeing all of the things that are resisting it. This is similar. So one of the ways that we work with this in the Undoing Whiteness group is dropping some very simple phrases in, like, when did you first know you were white? And just letting that sit there. And memories come up, and what people find surprises them. And what they find across the board, I'd say a good solid 99%, is most people discovered they were white in relationship to the emotion of fear. And usually at an extraordinarily young age, 4, 5, 3, you know, it's when they could actually, and in relationship to someone else. So when that's first seen, that is an extraordinary moment, because number one, whiteness is born into our consciousness, any race is, and it has a character to it that's born with it. It's not just neutral. So this is something to see. Other things you can drop in is, you know, and I'm going to use examples that have to do with white people working with this. It can be shifted by communities of color, do it in different ways. But just drop simply in, I'm white, or I am not white. And what comes up? What actually is, because we may not, and the reason we do this with koans in the beginning is because we may not know how to explore this. We don't know what we're doing. You know, we've never done it before. So just drop some things in to shake the tree a little bit and see what begins, and then we start getting the information we need to begin working. So other things, as I mentioned in the workshop, one thing that we ask all of our practitioners to do is, as a mindfulness practice, is anytime out in the world that you've noticed you've racialized someone, you've noticed you've made an assumption or you had a thought that basically was based on race, stop, literally stop, and recognize that you did it. That's it. Recognize that you did it and take responsibility for the mind doing it. Again and again and again and again. And we become very, very, very intimate with how automatic this process is in the mind. And it's important to see how automatic it is in the mind. And not only that, what we do to ourselves and how we're holding ourselves to these standards that we're not necessarily conscious of. So that's one thing. And then there are I think all of this is rooted in just remembering that the Buddha asked us to be critically engaged. It wasn't just, we talk a lot about being present, but the Buddha asked us to really look and see how things have come to be. And that's a critical engagement. That's just not, I'm watching for the sake of watching. I'm watching in order to understand the roots of the suffering that's occurring at this time. So any of the practices that are looking at this, that hold that process, are very, very powerful, and we'll each find our own, and I think that's important. The other things that I think that is, that's really important that aren't necessarily Buddhist practices are putting yourself in spaces you're not used to being in. Just put yourself in spaces where you're not dominant. And I don't care what the space is. Go to a Caribbean restaurant, I just start putting yourself in spaces where you understand what it feels like, and you start having a sense, because this having only white faces reflected back and being in these kinds of environments, it's very, very confusing, actually. It's extraordinarily confusing. And it creates an environment where we're not really connected to the world. And it's a beautiful process to be with the body. I don't know if it's beautiful, it's hard too. But it's beautiful in that it's difficult and transformative. To be with the body in a space where you're the only one in the room. You're the only one in the room. And to start having a connection to that without forgetting that you have the privilege of returning to the situation where that's not the case. Not to lose sight of that. But still to go through the practice process of feeling that, And one thing that I would not have, I didn't consciously think of as a practice, but I realized sitting here thinking about it that it was a practice throughout my adult life, which is being in non-white spaces that are for justice, and what it is to really hear voices and shut up, just listen, and really be in places where you're hearing the voice of justice that, and again, maybe sometimes it's only you. You're the only white face in the room. And to let that transform us. So that's just some. There are many that are not here, but just to begin boiling up and thinking about for all of us, what would shake up the way I think about who I am and start exposing what I normally can't see, because the hall of mirrors I walk in don't reflect it back to me. And so I need to choose different mirrors. I need to always, actually, that's an important practice thing that makes this so relevant in terms of Buddhist practice. We always have to be paying attention to the mirrors that we're using for the self that we're trying to wake up from. If our practice is, our awakening is only, what we always say in Zen, our awakening is only as wide as our eye of practice can reach. And if we limit the mirrors that show us who we are, then our eye of practice doesn't reach very far. And we're awake in a very limited area, and we'll choose not to go outside of that area because it's really uncomfortable, and inside of it we feel really awake, But the minute we walk outside of it, we feel really stupid and unnerved and all of that. And we need to walk outside so we can feel stupid and unnerved. That's what waking up is, feeling stupid and unnerved, and going through that process again and again and again and again and again. So any practices that we can use to increase those mirrors, I think, are extraordinarily important.
To allow 20 minutes for the things that are bubbling up in terms of comments and questions, so we have time for that.
So it's like 2 or 3 minutes per person is what you're saying? 10 minutes total?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So since I'm starting off again, I'll read the question, which is, what are the shadow sides of teaching that shut down conversations and bypass issues? There's a lot that can be said here, but there are kind of 2 main things that I wanted to touch on. One is just the sheer focus on the individual, and that Buddhism is often practiced as an individual liberation practice, and the focus, I would say especially in Western Buddhism, but I'm aware that this has happened in traditional Buddhism as well, that there have been recently in reading Thich Nhat Hanh, that even bringing in the philosophy of the Bodhisattva was in response to the lay people saying, you guys in the monasteries are just doing this for yourself. You know? So I think that it's very tempting to overlay Buddhism with Western individualistic culture and focus on ourselves and our thought patterns and our family relationships. And so to counter that with a teaching inside of Buddhism itself is interdependence, and that we are part of this big fractal universe. We are completely interrelated with everything that's out there. And so one way that I think about it is that there's a collective body that we are a part of. And that collective body is both social right now, and it's also historical. So we are a part of a larger organism that is humanity. And as we look at how that impacts us and how we impact that, then we can leave the individual focus that Buddhism can often take. The other thing that I just want to address, and I think this is really coming from my strong focus on patterns within whiteness and patterns within Western colonialism, imperialism, is to just notice the fact that Western Buddhism in particular is it's the process of a people from, we are white people, we are from a colonizing culture. And we are going to another place and learning these forms, which are freely offered. I'm not trying to say, oh, Buddhism is cultural appropriation and only Asians should practice it. But it is true that, I think we need to be educated and aware of the fact that we are a culture of colonizers. We are taught how to dominate. We are taught how to take. And so Western, I think there's a razor's edge in how to be a Western Buddhist and really respect the fact that this is not from our culture of origin, and always honor the teachers and the lineages that is coming from. I think it's been particularly challenging for insight Buddhism because insight practices aren't overseen by any Asian teachers. It's really been a development that has happened in the West. I think that the practitioner yesterday who talked about this divide between the Asian temples and the Western convert communities, that's a real thing. And I really appreciate Rebecca for talking about the challenges within the Asian temples and the ways that that you're addressing that, and people within those communities are addressing that. But from our side of it, I think that we have to look at what are there's been a pattern of Western practitioners looking down their noses at the Asian temples and saying, oh, that's cultural Buddhism, and that's not, we do the real Buddhism, which is this monastic tradition that's been adapted to lay Western life, and somehow that's like the real thing. And it's like it's like the emperor has no clothes. It's like, do you see that that's racism? Like, did you see the emperor? He's actually naked, you didn't see that? So it's, we can get so caught up in so many convoluted explanations of why we're thinking something that the obvious doesn't occur. The other thing that that is a pattern that is perhaps, well, there's two other things that happen. There's the consumer culture that we live in and the way that influences how we engage in spirituality. And of course, there's excellent material on spiritual materialism that you can look into. But then in sort of an older way of looking at European culture and colonialism is, I've thought of it as I was thinking about the kind of the pattern and the image that comes to my mind is the Western person as the adventurer who goes into the exotic, dangerous other place and comes back with trophies. So it's like the safari form of Western Buddhism. And just look for that, watch out for that, because these are patterns, and anytime there's a cultural pattern, we can fall into that pattern. And so applying Buddhism in that, really like vigilance of what is happening here. What are the patterns? Could this be happening? Always inquiring as to what is really going on. So.
I would, looking at this question, I think when I think about teacher training, many of us go through, Dharma teacher training, and that training doesn't necessarily include how to have discussions about power, race, class, and privilege, and intersectionality. There are trainings that deepen our relationship to Dharma and our practice of Dharma. So it's not an anti-racism training we're going to. So when we emerge as Dharma teachers, we have to actually acquire those tools through other trainings, through other means. I think that we expect teachers to have this set of skills that they may not have had. I find myself privileged in the discussion because this is what I was doing before I came to Dharma. I was an activist and an organizer and radicalized and all this stuff. And then, of course, I went into Dharma training and became a practitioner. There was definitely a period after I finished my training, my retreat practice, that I found it very difficult to integrate my activism with my Dharma work, and it took a lot of effort to push through that. So I think these big obstacles are that we're not trained. Most Dharma teachers aren't trained to do this. Secondly, I think many Dharma teachers, I don't want to use the word many, but there are Dharma teachers who aren't interested in interrogating power because they really like it. Because to be honest, in terms of patriarchy, we have all these male teachers. We wouldn't know who half of them were if it wasn't for patriarchy and for the privileging of their body in Dharma training. There are many Dharma teachers that have found their success and fame as Dharma teachers, and they don't want to give that up and question that. And that's a real thing, too, that we never talk about. And I think also, and I think there are other Dharma teachers who actually want to do the work, who want to have these conversations and model this from the cushion. They just don't know how to do it, which gives rise to, I think, my work in this field and also this conference is that, how do we help each other have these conversations? So I think there are just different ways of understanding that perhaps it's not always intentional, avoiding the conversation, but sometimes it is. How do we determine the difference, and how do we use our practice to approach and to strategize, around this in a loving and a kind way?
Thank you. That's actually a good segue of what I thought about in response to this question. I wrote down a bunch of things since I have only 2 minutes. I think, because I've been reflecting on my own experience of how I could integrate this effort in my own teaching, and I find myself feeling that it's just I cannot get it done the way I didn't know how to get started, and yesterday when I was on this extremely long bus ride, I realized that there is something that's been kind of invisible in the process, and that helped me understand the shadow word in this question. Is the shadow side. It's like, I feel it's like, I see it as the invisible aspect of Dharma teaching that's been going on is the way that the teaching space is being set up. I don't know how your group's teaching space is being set up, but in my tradition, usually it's people, they sit out there in rows, and then I sit up there, and they like to put me up in some platform, and I justify sitting up there by apologizing because I'm so tiny. If I don't do that, you won't be able to see me. But it's actually pretty standard procedure for the teacher to sit up there, which, it's okay to see the old master sitting up there. And when they made me sit up there, I was like, this doesn't feel right, and it doesn't feel right And I realize why now, because when the space is set up that way, we're creating this social context that communicates much more loudly than whatever you're going to say to them. It's like, ask whatever question, it's okay to say anything. They're like, no, no, no. The way that we set up the room is like, no, no, no. You're telling them that I'm the one who knows everything. You sit there and shut up and listen. And I have all the wisdom and all the right way, you know, and then you just let me tell you how to do it. That's what we have communicated to them by that setup. And of course, they put the teacher in a position where allowing her to show her vulnerability, to model this conversation, it's not acceptable. It's not because I don't want to do that. It's just like the people will be confused. Like we set up this place for you to sit up there to look like you're the one who knows everything, and then you sit there and talk about how I don't really know, you know. And then it's like people are like, what is going on? So I think perhaps we can become more conscious and aware of how we set up these practice spaces. And I had a little bit of that kind of experience. I started rearranging the cushions in the retreats so that people sit in a square and everyone face the center. 'Cause that's what I want, because people feel like they're supporting each other. And I realized that I was breaking the rule that like everyone's supposed to sit in rows and then they face a certain way. And I was like, oh, I guess I got ticketed or something. But like then, but I did it again the next time. So now they know, like if they watch this video. So, so like I asked myself, well, like should I go do it so that I arrange it so that I follow the standard format because that's how we have done it traditionally, or do I arrange everyone so that I believe it will be conducive to their practice? And it's just no doubt in my mind that I should choose the latter. But of course there is a little bit of time spent on, well, the politics of it and that kind of thing. So, and again, it is the work, doing the work of becoming sure that I believe I know what this is for the benefit of the practitioner. It's not for the benefit of the organization or for whoever, somebody saving someone's face or whatever it is. And so that's the one thing that I have to share on this question. Yeah. So.
I think I want to focus on one thing because I don't think we talk about it, which is the assumption that a particular subjectivity, so teachers, the way we work with looking at clinging and grasping and all of this, it assumes a particular kind of subjectivity, which is a very individual one. And not everybody is sitting down as an I. Lots of people in the world sit down as a we. And it took me, and I have my own pain around this because I grew up in a poor working class community that was Pennsylvania Dutch, and it was very much a we identity. And for years, I would have struggles with teachers around things because within this I identity, all anger, for example, is some problematic thing that needs to be worked out because you're attaching and so on and so forth. And that's not untrue. But sometimes anger, for example, is coming from a we. And that anger is connected deeply to love. And so I think that, we really have to, as teachers, we really have to understand that not everybody is sitting down with the same subjectivity. They're just not, And if you deeply, and forgive me, but most middle-class white folks do, they come from an I. It's trained, and you don't even see it, and it can feel like somebody hitting a gong, it's very strong. And I tried it, believe me, I tried very hard to do it. And I'm in a particular embodiment where it's very easy to fall into that. But it's extraordinarily painful to do. And so I think our human history is actually a history of we. And our human historic subjectivity is a we. And we have been convinced for reasons, capitalism and others, that, you know, of a particular I identity that is quite mobile, disconnected, can dominate the world, can do whatever it needs to do for its own interests. And that is just not the dominant subjectivity. And so it's not the most, well, it's the dominant, but it's not the most popular. And so I think that's really important, because I think it affects the way we meet students, and can be extraordinarily traumatizing, actually.
Now, let me make one other suggestion for the last question. As you can see right up here, it's as big as the other two. There's some resources that help to frame Dharma as liberatory, especially the socially liberating aspect of Dharma. What I want to suggest is that you name one resource and put it in a bag like at a children's birthday party that people can take home and do something at home. So you just say, well, here's the one resource I want to give to you, and then we can turn it over to questions.
Like a physical resource? Or what kind of resource?
I want to give up my privilege
Okay.
as professor here, and
Okay.
you can just you say what kind of resource you want to do, but just one resource. So we'll see if we can get it done in 5 minutes.
Great. So I will give my interpretation of what you just asked for. Yeah, so the question is, you know, resources that help frame the Dharma as liberatory. So, yeah, there's, actually, I'm going to very briefly mention 3. This is very brief, because there's 2 websites and a teacher that you already know and love. So Buddhists for Racial Justice has a good deal of resources there that are teachers teachers and articles and all different kinds of resources. There's a shared resources page, and there's some things that we put up, those of us who put the site up. But there's also a lot of people made comments, and there's like all kinds of jewels in that comment section of people who added resources to that. Also, there's a website called One Earth Sangha that is specifically focusing on bringing Buddhist lens to climate change, but they have a strong social justice focus, and there's a lot of incredible Dharma teachings you can find there. And then, of course, the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh. He's, you know, framed for us engaged Buddhism in a way that's really powerful for our time. Well, and then there's my website, White Awake, but, you know.
Great. My resource is Radical Dharma. You can do this right now. Pull out your cell phones or smartphones and pre-order this beautiful manuscripts. There's a manuscript now, but it's going to be a book by June. Right now, for $13 on Amazon. Well, you get a copy of the flyer, which everyone can have. It's in black and white, though. It's just a symbol of the real thing that you can own in June, June 14th. So that's you know, my thing, Reverend Angel and myself. It's my book, though. So, and even though her name is first and I think slightly bigger capped, which she probably did. But yeah, this is, we didn't have a resource like this. This is why we began this project together. It was just happenstance to do a little talk together, and then it turned into a speaking tour, which we had here last April, a year ago actually, over in the Braun Room here. It's all been turned into a book, essays, transcripts, and this is a wonderful tool. I mean, just to see teachers dialoguing about race, class, gender, queerness, sex, and liberatory practice, and rooted in love and awareness and kindness. So this is my resource.
The resource I'm recommending is this. So, 2 votes.
Actually, the resource, I was thinking, the resource that I was thinking about is what Rebecca's been talking about, which is the teaching of Buddha nature. Like to really, each of us to really remember in our hearts that we are already awake and there's confusion there and that the liberation process is coming from here. Nobody can give it to us. Nobody's got it. It's actually a part that wisdom is arising from each one of us, and that needs to be very, very clear as teachers, as students, as everything. So I would say reach down into that resource as deeply as we can.
Now let me just invite whether people have questions for everyone on the panel or comments that they want to make.
So, it was wonderful that Eleanor began by mentioning the Wampanoags, and I think Ray also mentioned about indigenous people and touching the earth and so on. I just wanted to mention the Dalits of India, who 60 years ago converted in huge numbers to Buddhism, 1956, and the inspiration of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and they're celebrating the 60th anniversary now, and also linking their struggle. There's a great deal of suicides going on in universities, people being arrested. There's great ferment in India right now, and they see themselves linking very much with the Black Lives Matter movement in this country and so on. But that movement also has inspired the Roma people of Europe, who used to be called the Gypsies, and they've discovered the Dalit Buddhist movement in India, and they're very much getting involved with studying the Dharma and feeling the Dharma nature and so on. And then there are the Baraku people of Japan, who are untouchables, basically, in that culture. And Dr. Ambedkar brought back 2 slogans from his studies in Europe and America. One was liberty, equality, fraternity, which you can map onto Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. If you play with this, it kind of works. But the main one was that the Fabian socialists in London used to say, educate, agitate, organize. It doesn't sound very Buddhist, but that's their slogan. So I just want to leave you with that, which actually I thought of when Ismail Jordan said this morning, can we be too angry, too passionate, or too mundane as we try to practice? And I think the answer is no.
I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to react or.
Eleanor didn't really flag her own resource. And you may not go to her workshop, which is happening next. I'm not going to it, but I want you to know what she's doing. I read her curriculum last night, and it's amazing. You've got to look at it, and you've got to try to use it because it's wonderful. All right, so the other thing is, another curriculum was mentioned at our lunch by the CMIC folks, and it's some out of Michigan dealing with beloved community, and I wonder if someone can give me a website for that.
Chris?
Thank you for speaking. I also want to thank you in the back for talking about what's happening in India right now. Some really deep grief. I have a question for Eleanor and maybe for everyone, but I just got back from retreat and there was this really couple interesting moments, and almost everyone on the retreat was white, all the teachers were white, and there's this really interesting moment when a couple of people said like, oh, I'm just really noticing the sangha, I'm noticing the community. And I was sort of like, oh, wow, like you really don't know. Like this is such a tenuous, thin layer of community, like, and this feels nourishing to you, like, wow. And I think part of why our sangha at CIMC is struggling is sort of like, like, how do middle-class white people learn what sangha really is? Because, like, yeah, because I think that's important because then you know what you're missing, you know? Not to say that, like, everyone else has it all figured out, but, like, you know, how do people, especially middle-class white people, learn, like, oh, actually, like, I'm, you know, without going and taking someone else's, like, you know.
Well, I feel a little humbled having that question addressed to me, but I think that it's part of the socialization to be a dominant group of people, is that you can't, it's part of what has happened that is so fractured. I think understanding our history can help us understand what we don't have and why we keep trying to take it from other people. And so this has actually been kind of a teaching I've received from other friends of mine who are involved in paganism, and going back and trying to understand what are the indigenous or the pre-Christian practices in Europe and what happened to them. And I also think it's important to, as we think about why the Europeans came over and did what they did and then went out and expanded all over the world in the way that they have, why? What was happening in Europe? And so there's a lot of violence and a lot of trauma, and it's been taken with us. And then there's needing to create a collective of white people here in the US really for the interest of the ruling class that needed to be able to control people. And so there's somewhere recently I read about, like, I think in the Henry Ford Company, they had a practice of, like, all the European people who had come and immigrated recently, they would take and they would go through this little ritual where they would, I think they took some classes or something first, and then they would put on their traditional garb and they would get in a big cauldron, and then they would take off whatever their traditional European stuff was, and they would put on their sort of Anglo, you know, American dress and step out. Now I'm American, and I'm not Irish anymore, and I'm not Italian anymore, and I'm not. So there's been a huge loss. And how people do that is they need to get together. You know, they need to just get together and spend time together. There's actually a really lovely book by Sobonfu Some, who's an indigenous African woman who she and her husband have been kind of sent to the West as emissaries to help heal us because they're like, wow, these people are destroying our culture and destroying the earth, and they really need some help. And she talks about community, and she talks about how her people, she's like, you're never going to have community the way that I have a community as an indigenous person, but she suggests, she's like, find some folks and get together with them regularly and eat a meal together and raise your kids together and just spend time together. And I think that it has to be seen as a spiritual practice, and people have to find a way of connecting that nourishes them so that it's not just another thing you're trying to put into your calendar. And, you know, one thing that maybe another just thought that comes to my mind is there's some folks I met with here in Boston who are part of, they're activists, but they're working with an Episcopalian network where people are forming these community, what are they calling it? Contemplative Action Circle, thank you. And it's people who are really dedicated to the, social change, but they're going to get together like once a week or at least every other week, and they're going to grieve together, and they're going to eat together, and they're going to embolden one another to action, to take risk in the community together. So I think that having so much comfort and so much materialism in between ourselves and other people, and it's hard to overcome that. It's hard to see what you're lacking. But having a reason to come together is, you know, and then sticking to it until you begin to feel it. And then you don't want the other stuff so much. It's like a kid that's eating a bunch of candy and then takes them a while to eat real food. And then they're like, oh, I don't want that stuff and I don't want the junk anymore. I want the real food. So that's a bit rambling, but that's what comes to my mind. Yeah. Oh, Sobonfu Some, and that book is, I believe it's called Welcoming Spirit Home. Yeah, it's beautiful.
So this addresses something that Rebecca mentioned, but I'd be happy for anybody to address it. So I've noticed that Dharma spaces can be organized, or are most of the time organized in ways that are deeply hierarchical. And especially with issues of race, class, and gender, there's so much pain and fraughtness around hierarchy and ways of organizing that are deeply disproportionately powerful in one area and not in another. But I also see hierarchy in a Dharma setting as being nurturing in its own way and even energizing if it's done in a way that's respectful. And so my question is, how do you navigate spaces of Dharma practice being perhaps completely hierarchical in some ways and democratic in other ways? Or how, and also, how do we address issues of injustice without needing to democratize all aspects of our way of being in the world?
I'll start before, when you guys think about what to talk about. Thank you, it's true. I think there is this knee-jerk reaction against hierarchy, and hierarchy doesn't need to be bad. As long as people in the position of power are very clearly aware of the power and use their power and authority wisely for the benefits of everyone. That is the reason why in a lot of these, especially more Asian Buddhist communities, they embrace that hierarchy, like with the master that they really have deep trust in. They feel a lot of support and comfort in that. And so, and especially in the context of a teaching or retreats, people come and want someone to lead them in the practice, and it is, I think it is the it is the responsibility of the individual occupying the position of power in this hierarchy, to recognize that responsibility, to ensure that the space is held, that allow everyone to feel included, that this is a space where everyone feels welcome and can practice here, because not everyone in the space is sensitive enough to create the environment, especially in the beginning. And of course, in outside of retreat context, that's the same thing. So I think individual holding that position in the upper part of the hierarchy, that will be his or her responsibility. And so it doesn't need to be the abuse of power, like, Rod talks about that, but like it can be someone who, I live in the world that's literally what my master had to do. It's like, the natural tendency for group cliques to form and for people to feel excluded, or in the case, it's like for people who donate more to feel that they should have more say. There's a very natural thing. And so it's the leader's responsibility to say, no, we're not going to fall for that. And so everyone, will be equally welcome. And we got to lead everyone, to help everyone to fight against our natural kind of selfish tendency. So I agree with you. That is but it's the job of the leader to be very aware of their own biases, and also the social context, again, for me, like that invisible dynamic that can cause individuals to behave the way they do and work with them to hold that space. So thank you for bringing up the question.
I had a few thoughts. I was reminded of, in undergraduate work, I looked a lot at indigenous political structures. And one thing that is very interesting, all the way from the Amazonian region up to the northern United States, there's built in these rituals. The Jivaro, for example, have this ritual of insulting the chief a few times a week. Like literally they lay in the hammock and they just insult him for, and then there's potlatch, in the north. There's all these ways that are built in where it's very, people who have social power can't accrue other kinds of power. They can't accrue economic or significant political power. And one of the reasons that's built in is because deeply within the American indigenous community is an understanding that leadership, or the right to leadership, should only be given if it expresses the social values of the community. And that's the only reason it's earned through that process. And if there's any way, and all the avenues for stepping out of that are cut off. So I think that's something really important for us as sanghas to keep in mind. If we see our leadership not, the leadership is, domination's the problem, or exploitation's the problem, or control's the problem. Power is, we talked about this in the workshop, power can be used for love, so, and care, so that's not the problem. But if we notice, we have to be very engaged and active. If we notice that our leadership are not, their actions are not expressing the values of the community or the values of the Dharma, get them out. They're not sacred. Get them out. Shut the community down. We need to be held to that. So.
William Blake has a poem that he addressed to a sunflower that begins, "O sunflower, weary of time, who follows the steps of the sun." I'm often weary of time these days, but I'm particularly weary of time right now because I would like to listen to you and the panelists for a lot longer. The light in the window and that clock in the back, which is reflecting the steps of the sun, is saying that the sun is going on and there's other breakout sessions to happen. I want to have a chance for us to practice the important Buddhist virtue of recognizing what has been done and thanking our panelists for the last hour and a half.